I need to tell you about the phone call first. Not because it is the most dramatic thing that happened, though it is close, but because it is the thing that made everything else possible, and if you do not understand the phone call you will not understand what two women were able to do together that neither one of us could have done alone. It came on a Wednesday evening in November, from a number I did not recognize, and the woman on the other end said my name once, quietly, like she had been practicing saying it and had finally decided to make the call before she lost the nerve. She said, "My name is Claire. I was Marcus's first wife. And there are things you need to know. Marcus is my husband. Was my husband. The man I had built 4 years of my life around, the man I had trusted with my finances and my future and the particular kind of hope that belongs to people who have decided to believe in someone completely." I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs made the decision before my brain did, and I said, "Tell me." What Claire told me that evening took 4 to 7 minutes and changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my marriage, my husband, and the 4 years I had spent inside a pattern I had not known was a pattern because I had not known there was a first version of it. Stay with me. Because what Claire and I discovered together, in the weeks after that phone call, is the kind of story that reminds you that the most powerful thing two women can do when a man has tried to erase them both is compare notes. Welcome to Signed in Silence. My name is Rachel. And this is the story of two wives, one pattern, and the attorney who told us she had never seen a more complete case walk through her door. I met Marcus Webb at 28, at the kind of party where everyone is a friend of a friend and the introductions are casual and the conversations float freely between people who have no particular reason to remember each other and occasionally every reason to. Marcus had a quality I have since learned to identify and was then too young and too hopeful to name correctly. He made you feel, within 20 minutes of meeting him, that he had been waiting specifically for you. Not in a performed way. In a way that felt organic and real and which I now understand was neither of those things but was instead the result of considerable practice on a specific kind of person. I was that specific kind of person. Independent, professionally successful, emotionally self-sufficient in the way that sometimes means a person has learned to need very little from others because needing things has not historically gone well. Marcus read that in me immediately, the way certain people read rooms, and he calibrated accordingly. He did not overwhelm me with attention, which would have made me cautious. He gave me exactly enough to make me come toward him. We dated for a year. He was thoughtful and consistent and funny in the dry, understated way I have always found more appealing than obvious humor. He remembered things. He showed up when he said he would. He met my friends and was liked by them, which I weighted heavily because my friends are perceptive people and their collective approval felt like evidence. We got married when I was 30, in a small ceremony that was exactly what I wanted because Marcus had asked what I wanted and then made it happen, which seemed like the most loving thing a person could do and which I now understand was also the most effective way to make me feel entirely chosen, because a woman who gets exactly what she asked for is a woman who stops asking questions. I worked in financial consulting. Marcus worked in corporate development, which means he understood deal structures and organizational strategy and the kind of high-level business thinking that impresses people at dinner parties and which gave him, in our marriage, a credibility around financial decisions that I extended without examining. He suggested we keep separate accounts for most things and a joint account for shared household expenses, which was the same structure I had always used in my adult life and which seemed sensible. He managed the joint account. I managed my individual finances. We were both professionals. The arrangement seemed balanced. It was not balanced. I understand that now in a way I could not then, because balance requires transparency and transparency requires both people to be operating in good faith, and one of us was not. The first year of marriage was good in the ways that first years of good marriages are good. Then the second year had a texture to it that I noticed and catalogued without examining. Marcus traveled more for work. The travel was always explained and always plausible. He was distracted in ways I attributed to work pressure. His phone was always nearby and always face down, which I noted and set aside because noting things is not the same as confronting them, and I had learned, somewhere in my history, to give people the benefit of the doubt until the doubt outweighed the benefit. By year 3 I was giving the doubt considerable benefit. By year 4 I was in the financial consulting equivalent of what a doctor calls clinical denial, which is when you know what the symptoms mean and you continue ordering tests because the tests give you something to do while you avoid the diagnosis. The diagnosis arrived in the form of Claire's phone call. Claire Webb, formerly Claire Marsh, had been Marcus's wife for 3 years before I met him. They had divorced when she was 29, 2 years before Marcus and I started dating, in a proceeding she described as straightforward and financially unremarkable, which meant Marcus had been cooperative and the settlement had been fair, and she had moved on with the efficient pragmatism of a woman who decides that the past is the past and the future is where the energy belongs. She had moved on. She had built a new life. She had, in the way that people do when they are genuinely healing rather than performing it, stopped thinking about Marcus Webb as anything other than a chapter that had closed. Then she had run into a mutual acquaintance at a conference, a woman who knew us both, who had mentioned in passing that Marcus's new wife, meaning me, had seemed quieter lately and a little tired in the way that is not about sleep. Claire had thought about that for 3 weeks. Then she had found my number. I almost didn't call, she told me. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. That I could be wrong. That even if I was right, it was 4 years ago and maybe he had changed. She paused. But I remembered how I felt in year 3. That specific kind of tired. And I thought if someone had called me, I would have wanted them to. I sat on the kitchen floor and I listened to Claire describe my marriage. Not her marriage. My marriage. The same patterns, the same textures, the same specific architecture of behavior that I had been cataloguing for 2 years and attributing to work pressure and personal complexity and the ordinary friction of 2 people sharing a life. She described the phone face down on the table. She described the travel that was always explained. She described the financial opacity that felt like efficiency rather than concealment. She described the way he made you feel chosen and the way that feeling slowly, gradually, became something you were working to earn rather than something you simply had. She described it all with the flat precision of someone who has had years to understand what they experienced and who is now, for the first time, hearing that someone else experienced the exact same thing in the exact same sequence. We talked for 47 minutes. At the end she said, I have documents. From our divorce. Financial records, correspondence, some things my attorney gathered during discovery that I kept because my attorney told me to keep everything. I don't know if they're relevant to your situation. But I wanted you to know they exist. I said, can we meet? We met the following Saturday at a coffee shop neither of us had been to before, which was a choice we made without discussing it and which I noted afterward as evidence that we were both, independently, thinking clearly about what this meeting was. Claire was smaller than I had imagined from her voice, with the kind of composed energy that belongs to people who have been through something difficult and have organized themselves around it rather than being organized by it. She brought a folder. I brought my laptop. We sat across from each other and I looked at the woman who had been where I was 4 years ago and she looked at the woman who was where she had been, and there was a recognition in that exchange that did not require explanation. She opened the folder and I opened my laptop and we compared notes. What we found, laid out across a coffee shop table on a Saturday morning, was not 2 separate stories. It was one story, told twice, with different names in the supporting roles and identical structure in the lead. The financial pattern was the first thing. Claire had discovered, during her divorce discovery process, that Marcus had maintained a secondary account throughout their marriage, funded by small regular transfers from their joint account. The amounts were modest, never large enough to be obvious, always varied enough to avoid pattern recognition. By the time her attorney had identified and documented them, the total over 3 years of marriage was $28,000. I looked at that number. Then I opened the joint account records I had pulled the week before, because Claire's initial call had given me enough to start looking and I had spent the intervening week looking with the focused attention of a financial consultant who finally has a reason to examine something she had been deliberately not examining. My number, over 4 years of marriage, was $34,500. Different amounts. Same account structure. Same transfer methodology. Same destination account profile, an external account registered to what appeared to be a consulting entity, a different name from mine but the same architecture as the one Claire's attorney had found. We sat with those 2 numbers for a moment. 28,000 and 34,500. 2 marriages, 2 women, 1 man, 1 method. He refined it, Claire said quietly. The amounts are slightly better concealed in yours. He had more practice, I said. We looked at each other and something passed between us that was not quite solidarity and not quite grief and was entirely its own thing, the specific recognition of two people who have been through the same experience and are, for the first time, able to call it by its accurate name. The second thing we found was the behavioral documentation. Claire had kept a journal during her marriage, the kind of private record that people keep when they are trying to make sense of something they cannot yet name, and reading back through it in preparation for our meeting she had found entries that described, in her own words from 4 years ago, the exact behaviors I had been cataloguing in my own mind for 2 years. The travel. The phone. The distraction. The specific texture of a presence that was physically there and emotionally somewhere else. I had not kept a journal. But I had emails. A financial consultant's habit of documentation had meant that over the course of 4 years I had a searchable record of communications that, when I looked at them with new eyes, told their own story. Dates when Marcus had said he was in one place and the email metadata suggested something inconsistent. Patterns in his availability that aligned with the transfer activity. Small things that were individually meaningless and collectively a map. The third thing was the one that made Claire's attorney, when we sat across from her the following week, put her pen down and look at us both for a long moment before she said anything. Claire's divorce records included a confidential financial disclosure that Marcus had submitted during their proceedings, a sworn statement of his assets and liabilities at the time of the divorce. It was, Claire's attorney had noted at the time, a complete and cooperative disclosure. It had appeared honest. It had not been honest. The secondary account, which Claire's attorney had identified through bank subpoenas during discovery, had not appeared on the voluntary disclosure. Marcus had sworn to a complete financial picture and omitted an account containing $28,000 of marital funds. That was a sworn false statement in a legal proceeding. Claire's attorney, when we met with her the following week, a woman named Susan Park who had been practicing family law for 18 years and who had the particular sharpness of someone who has seen every version of every story and is occasionally still surprised by the audacity, looked at the documentation we had assembled and was quiet for longer than I expected. Then she said, "You have 2 independent instances of the same financial concealment pattern, documentary evidence of a false sworn disclosure in a prior legal proceeding, and a combined financial record that establishes a deliberate methodology rather than isolated misconduct." She looked at me specifically. "For your proceeding, this is exceptionally strong. The prior instance establishes pattern and intent. It removes the possibility of arguing that the concealment in your marriage was accidental or situational." Then she looked at us both. "And for the prior proceeding, the new evidence may have implications for the existing settlement that we should discuss separately." We discussed it separately. The implications were real and they were significant and they moved on a timeline that I am not going to detail here because some parts of this story belong to Claire and not to me. What I will say is that Susan Park earned her reputation in the weeks that followed. The filing of my petition was the beginning of the formal part. Before the filing, there was a period of additional documentation that I approached with the methodical focus of a professional preparing a regulatory submission, which is what it felt like. Because the skills I had spent a decade building in financial consulting are precisely the skills required to construct an airtight financial disclosure record. I documented the transfers. I documented the account structure. I cross-referenced the transfer methodology against Claire's records to establish the pattern. I built a timeline that covered 4 years of my marriage and incorporated the relevant elements of Claire's 3-year prior marriage, not as emotional narrative but as dated, sourced, cross-referenced financial documentation. Susan called it the most organized client file she had received in 5 years of practice. I told her I had learned from a colleague who was a CPA, which was true, because Dana's story, which a friend had shared with me, had reminded me that the numbers are always there and they always tell the truth when you ask them the right questions. Marcus was served on a Thursday morning. I know because Susan texted me the confirmation and I was in a client presentation and I felt my phone vibrate in my jacket pocket and I finished the presentation without looking at it because the presentation was for a client who deserved my full attention and Marcus had already taken enough of it. He called 11 times between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. I let every call go to voicemail. The voicemails were a progression I had anticipated, having heard Claire describe her version of the same progression, from controlled to confused to explanatory to emotional to, by the 11th message, something that was trying to be contrite and landing instead as frightened. He came to the house that evening. He had a key and I had not yet changed the locks because changing them before he was served would have been a tactical error Susan had warned me against. He came in and I was in the living room and I stayed where I was. He sat down across from me and he looked at me with the face he had used for 4 years to make me feel chosen, and I looked back at him with the face I had learned to keep neutral in client meetings when the numbers told me something the client did not want to hear, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Rachel, whatever you think you know, let me explain." I said, "Susan Park is my attorney. Her number is on the table. Please have your attorney contact her." He looked at the piece of paper with Susan's number. He looked at me. "How much do you know?" he said. It was the wrong question. The right question, for a man in his position, would have been, is there any version of this that can be repaired? The fact that he asked how much I know rather than what can I do told me everything I needed to know about what this conversation was going to be, which was a negotiation about damage control rather than an attempt at accountability. "Everything," I said. "And so does Claire." The color left his face in a way I had never seen before on him, which was interesting because I had spent 4 years studying his face and thought I knew its full range. The mention of Claire's name produced something new. Something that looked, for just a moment, like the genuine shock of a man who had maintained 2 separate stories and had just understood that the 2 stories had found each other. He left without saying anything else. I heard his car and then I did not hear it, and I sat in the living room with the silence of a house that had held a lie for 4 years and was, starting now, going to hold only the truth. The proceeding took 5 months. Marcus's attorney was competent and experienced, and the process was adversarial in the way that family law proceedings are adversarial when one party has reason to resist full financial disclosure and the other party has a financial consultant's documentation skills and a prior marriage attorney as a resource. The pattern evidence was the center of it. Marcus's attorney argued initially that the transfers in our marriage were for legitimate purposes he had not disclosed because of their sensitive business nature, which lasted approximately 1 session before Susan presented Claire's documentation establishing that the identical methodology had been used in the prior marriage for purposes that had ultimately been found to be personal rather than professional. The argument that the prior false disclosure was irrelevant to the current proceeding was the next line of defense. Susan addressed it efficiently. Pattern evidence in a financial misconduct case is relevant precisely because it establishes intent and methodology, removing the possibility of the claim that the behavior was isolated or inadvertent. 2 instances of the same specific financial concealment structure, in 2 successive marriages, to 2 women who had never compared notes until they did, was not a coincidence. It was a method. The settlement that emerged from 5 months of negotiation reflected the full picture. The $34,500 in dissipated marital assets was credited to my share. The equitable distribution of our remaining assets was calculated with the dissipation credit applied before any other division was made. The outcome was fair in the precise sense that fair means in law, which is not equal but accurate, reflecting the actual financial history of the marriage rather than the story Marcus had hoped to tell about it. He signed the settlement on a Monday. I was not in the room. Susan had suggested I did not need to be present, and she was right, because there was nothing for me to say or hear in that room that the documents had not already said more clearly than I could. Claire and I had coffee the week after my settlement was final. We sat at the same coffee shop where we had spread our documents across the table 5 months earlier, and this time there were no documents and no laptops, and the conversation was about things that were not Marcus Webb. We talked about our work and our plans and the particular lightness that belongs to people who have put something heavy down and are still getting used to the new weight of their own hands. Before we left, she said something I have thought about many times since. "I almost didn't call," she said again. "I almost talked myself out of it." "I know," I said. "I'm glad I didn't." "So am I," I said. "So is my attorney." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that arrives without warning and means something genuine, and I thought that was probably the best sound that coffee shop had heard in a while. I want to say something to the people watching this who are in a marriage that has a texture they cannot quite name. The low-grade wrongness that does not rise to the level of a confrontable thing. The pattern that is only visible when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. The exhaustion that is not about sleep. Pay attention to that texture. Not because attention proves anything. Not because noticing is the same as knowing. But because the texture of a thing is information, and information deserves to be taken seriously rather than set aside in the service of a piece that is costing you more than you are aware of. And if someone calls you on a Wednesday evening from a number you do not recognize and says there are things you need to know, answer the call. Sit down first. But answer it. The most powerful thing two women can do when a man has built his life on the assumption that his stories will never meet is introduce those stories to each other. The stories did not like what they found when they met. But we did. I am 36 now. I have an apartment I chose for myself, for reasons that had nothing to do with what anyone else would think of it, and it is exactly right in the specific way that things are exactly right when you have chosen them without reference to someone else's approval. I am building my consulting practice in the direction I want to build it rather than the direction that fit around someone else's schedule and preferences and carefully constructed opacity. Claire and I have dinner occasionally, which is the kind of sentence that would have been incomprehensible to me a year ago and which is now simply true. She is building her own things. We do not talk about Marcus. There is nothing about Marcus left to say that the legal record has not already said more precisely and permanently than either of us could manage. The file is with Susan, archived in the way that legal files are archived, and it will sit there accurately and permanently in the way that records sit when they have been properly made. The numbers are correct. The dates are accurate. The methodology is documented. The pattern is established. A pattern that is established in a record cannot be unestablished. Marcus Webb may tell a different story somewhere. He has always been skilled at stories. But the record tells the accurate one, and the record does not change based on the skill of the storyteller. That is the thing about a properly made document. It does not need you to believe it. It simply continues to be true. That is my story. A phone call on a Wednesday evening, a coffee shop table covered in documents, two women who had never met comparing notes on the same man, and an attorney who looked at what we had built together and said she had never seen a more complete case walk through her door. If someone is trying to tell you something you need to hear, let them finish. And if you have information that someone else needs, find the courage that Claire found on a Wednesday evening when she had been almost talked out of calling. Almost is not the same as didn't. And didn't would have cost me everything. Subscribe to Signed in Silence. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. The next story is already waiting, and the woman in it is about to find something that changes everything she thought she knew. I will see you in the next one.